I'm astonished to hear that any of my trivial efforts have been accepted in this way, and I'm deeply grateful. I've been associated with New Zealand for a very long time. I've had enormous pleasure. I have many friends here, and to be received in this way is beyond my wildest dreams. Thank you, and thank you, Governor General. That's right. And thank you, Westpac, who sponsored this. I shall take this lovely bronze and treasure it and use it and place it in favourable places for a long time, I hope. When New Zealand friends ask me to a party, I'm very inclined to accept. And when I come, I feel very humble, and I usually bring a theoretical stool on which I can sit at their feet, because I have great admiration for them as people and for what they're doing and for this country. My stool normally has 4 legs, and I thought I might just tell you about the story of each of the 4 legs. Now, the first one was created and built in the Middle East, where I served as a soldier, having been a territorial officer, and had great discomfort in the Western Desert, near where Tobruk is in the news. And I was then put upon the staff, and I had a few years of a very agreeable and interesting life. And there I encountered New Zealand volunteer officers who'd come to help the mother country. And they were always competent, trustworthy, honest, and fun. And we worked together in great affinity and, I hope, effectiveness. And I can remember that one stage in the war, Winston Churchill had a belief that the way to beat the Germans was to invade Yugoslavia and the southern belly of Europe, and avert, therefore, the problem of having to invade France. He was overruled by the Americans, but it meant that in the Middle East we had a build-up of people who were ready to invade southern Europe, and that included me and some very attractive, desirable New Zealand colleagues. We were put to learn modern Greek and other skills in northern Cyprus, a little town called Kyrenia. And by happy chance, on the way to Kyrenia, where I was being sent, I acquired an ocean-going yacht from one of the private armies that existed with a crew. And the only responsibility I had was to look after this yacht and see that it was ready for operations at a moment's notice. I took that to mean the thing to do was to use it every day. Do you disagree? No, of course you don't. And the result of this was we had the most delicious sailing in the northern Mediterranean, with my crew, sometimes those desirable New Zealand officers, some of whom had never sailed before, and we had great fun. Now, that was the first leg of this stool. Now, the second leg was that in 1958, having had to return to earn my living in London, I was asked would I join the board of the National Mortgage and Agency Company. And I asked what was that. It was a pastoral company serving the interests of the farming community in the south of South Island. I was a farmer too, and I very quickly decided that this was a unique opportunity. It wasn't charitable, it was business, but what we were doing from London, this was a London board, was raising money in London to send out to augment the resources in New Zealand to develop the farming of South Island. We operated through a London board of people of sufficient respectability to be able to raise the money, and a very outstanding group of people headed by Jim Ritchie and others who managed the use of this money in the farming community of Southland. And the thing worked like a charm. When they wanted more resources, we were in a position to produce it. Now, the end of this story is that bit by bit, as the demands of the farming community grew, we were able to raise the money in London, which was not available in New Zealand, and bit by bit, many New Zealand-based companies joined us, so that we became, in the end, a national company. And I say this with great pride, because I think this was an example of a world-class company doing a thoroughly good job, rewarding its shareholders, serving its customers, and promoting the future of New Zealand. That's the second leg. Now, the third leg is rather more surprising. I had a great-great-uncle who was a distinguished naval officer who suddenly found himself in the head of a meeting, the chairman of a meeting held at the Connellist, whatever that was, in the Strand in 1851. Now, the purpose of this was to assemble the knowledge of the success or otherwise of the Connellists, I can't get the word right, Connellists, in New Zealand, and encourage, therefore, further people coming to colonize this great country. In part of his, I've seen the records of this meeting, and he was making a distinction between himself, who was interested in the whole of the, I can't get this word right, colonization of New Zealand, but he was not part of what he called the Canterbury Association. Now, I can only detect there must have been some competition between Canterbury and the rest of New Zealand. And he was careful to say, my interests are in the whole of New Zealand, not only Canterbury. And he then had to confess that he had the wife of his, the sister of his wife, who'd married somebody who'd had the good fortune to become a settler in Canterbury. So this, I suppose, was declaring in a very proper way his interest. The meeting ended by a lovely distinction made that the meeting considered that the people who came to New Zealand were genuine settlers, and the distinction was the people who went to Australia were out there to make a quick buck and clear off. And I think that's proved to be the case, probably. But now that was my third leg. Now my fourth leg will beat most of you, because I want to talk about a man called Frank Holmes. And there'll be deadly silence. Nobody will say here, I know all about Frank Holmes, but you should. And you'll have to listen to me. Now, Frank Holmes was one of those adventurous New Zealanders, loyal New Zealanders, who came to defend the mother country in the 1418 war. He found himself in Iraq. I think he was an engineer, and at the end of the war, he decided to stay in Iraq rather than come back home, because he had engineering skills, and he divined that he could earn a living drilling water wells in the desert, which was vitally important. And he set about doing this. At the time, the oil industry was developing. The British had their big concession in Persia in Iran, the Anglo-American Oil Company, and in northern Iraq there was oil being produced. And Frank Holmes, for skills I don't know, decided that there was a great oil reservoir under the kingdom of Saudi Arabia, which was then in the hands of Ibn Saud, who became eventually the king. And he went off to find Ibn Saud, riding probably a donkey or a camel or something, and found him, and eventually said to him, I would like to have a concession to develop the oil of Saudi Arabia. And he offered Ibn Saud the princely sum of $5,000 and the additional advantage of an annual income when the oil was discovered of £2,000 per annum. Now, the end of this little story is that he then, with this concession, which he got for $5,000, went back to England, but found the oil companies so busy elsewhere they wouldn't listen to him. And eventually, it was the Americans who decided that he was right, and from that was descended the great Saudi Arabian oil company of Aramco, which is, I still think, the biggest oil company in the world. And this man, Frank Holmes, had in his hand as the concession for what we always regarded as 30% of the free world's oil. Now, that is a great New Zealander. And I would call him a gold-plated one. The end of that little story is that he got nothing for the reward from his $5,000 investment, but he also had an investment in the prospects of Bahrain Island, which became a trivial oil supplier, but he managed, by building up a syndicate of people in London, to get that started, and he became the major shareholder of what is now called Bapco, which after 50 years on or more is still producing oil. And as I knew him, as a farmer in Essex, he was living comfortably from the income from his dairy cows and also from the oil of Bahrain. Now, those are very distinguished New Zealanders, and I think a prime example of what we're about tonight. Thank you very much for receiving me and giving me this wonderful honor.